Morning. Thank you for being here with us today.
I'm very excited. These are really big issues. And I was at the first State of the Net. So I started practicing broadcast law in 1989 when there were still comparative hearings, and it was just a different time when I think 16 broadcast stations was too much market power. So a different time indeed.
Different time. Wow. Okay. In that case, I'll start with a question that taps into your deep background, your long background in tech policy. So recently, FCC Chair Brendan Carr said that the agency is not a formally independent agency. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think that's absurd. It is an independent agency along with the FTC and many others, and that is something that is being proposed by this administration in terms of a lot of the use of this administration's kind of pushing forward their agenda. But first and foremost, the FCC was authorized by Congress. The power of the purse is invested under Article 1 in Congress. And so really we fund the FCC and we authorize the FCC, and our legislation lays out what the FCC does. Moreover, I think that it's difficult right now because you're seeing a lot of weaponizing, I think, of this administration of the FCC in terms of coercive or potentially ability to sign off on various merger applications or broadcast or satellite. So if you have the ability to deal with some of these larger issues of coercion in terms of how you look at freedom of the press and some of these other issues, i.e. Jimmy Kimmel or CBS, it's a problem. But I think even more importantly, I think that for business, and listen, I represent the Maryland 6th Congressional District. I have NIST and NIH, the National Cancer Institute, Fort Detrick, but we have so much research and innovation within the 6th District. And long-term infrastructure needs regulatory certainty from tariffs, but also in terms of we don't want flip-flopping of regulatory policies every 4 years. You need a bipartisan commission that is focused on what is best for the public interest and in terms of furthering what is good for our U.S. competitiveness and our national security. So I would say it is a good thing to have an independent commission for our country, for our public interest, for our consumers. Pretty much, full stop.
Thank you for that. So you've also worked on tech policy issues from another side of the coin. Before you came to Congress, you worked for Common Sense Media, an NGO dedicated to safeguarding children online. And now you have a new bill, the Algorithm Accountability Act, which would impose a duty of care that would require social media platforms to design their algorithms in a way that prevents foreseeable harm to children, if I'm getting that right. So why this focus on policing the product design rather than policing the content on the platforms?
So before I answer this question, I think I have to lift up a little bit and look back. I lobbied on the 96 Act when it was dial-up AOL, and we thought, of course, the internet should be unregulated. And I started with Common Sense Media in 2006, before Google was a verb and Facebook was in its infancy. And we've seen kind of the trajectory of what has happened. And for many years, I was very focused on the health and well-being of children and how media impacted it, good and bad, in terms of learning, but also tech addiction, issues of mental health and well-being, and how the algorithms and the design really impacted our kids' mental health, physical health, cognitive health. I worked for, I think, almost 10 years to get CAMERA, the Children and Media Research Act, passed in Congress. It passed actually when I was at NTIA, which was longitudinal research through NIH to really look at media. So algorithms and data are really important. And we have yet to have a comprehensive privacy piece of legislation, even though we've been lobbying for it for almost 20 years. It is really important still, I think, and the EU is ahead of us. They obviously have done a lot in the privacy arena, but we've really got to look at how data is collected, but also the algorithms. And why would we want to have harms happen and not stop them before? So on the Senate side, senators, it's bipartisan, Curtis and Kelly, and on the House side, the senators Kennedy and I got this bill, which is really about, if it should be very common sense, if media companies or platforms know that there is a substantial risk and a duty of care that these, by design, they could have harm or substantial harm or even injury on a child, that they should be liable for it and there should be a private right of action. Because I really do believe for there to be accountability and change, there must be some type of liability or some sort of penalty, or else it's never going to change. And we've seen the line just keep on moving. And it's something, as a lifelong child advocate, I think that there has to be enough is enough, and we have to start thinking about ways that we can more creatively both encourage. Listen, I represent NIST, I represent NIH. I'm a big believer in innovation and having a robust competition and underpinning our U.S. competitiveness. But we do need to have bumpers and safeguards for our kids and for all of us. So in addition to this, COSA is obviously up right now, which is the Kids Online Safety Act, which is modeling and modifying how COPPA, which is the one privacy act for kids, is being looked at. But I think there's a whole host, and you'll see it from my Democratic and Republican colleagues, of how data is being collected and how it's being fed even into some of these AI systems. Taking that data. Also, our government, my biggest thing when I came into Congress is when DOGE was first starting, and it's really hard for me because I have 35,000 government workers, so I was very focused on some of these cuts, but also that many agencies and the mass databases, whether it's the IRS, the Social Security, whether it's USDA for our farmers, I think that when you give your information to the government, whether it be for your tax returns or whether for Social Security or your health information, which should be protected by HIPAA, that data would be safeguarded and protected by our government. But when it is taken and given to third parties and fed into AI systems, I think it is something that most Americans don't think will happen. And I think it's really important that we lift up and look at what data is going in and then how it's being used in terms of our algorithms, but ultimately fed into AI.
Terrific. And
So-
reminding us all of the actions you took about a year ago when farmers' data was being directly accessed by DOGE without
So I'm a farmer's daughter from Idaho. I came from Buell, Idaho. I went to Northwestern, was communication studies, and then I got a scholarship to go to Georgetown Law. So I've been here since the 80s. And when I went into Congress, ENC was a bridge too far because that's something that takes a while for a freshman to get on. And so I said, what will help my district? I have a lot of farmers in the Maryland's 6th congressional district all the way up to Western Maryland. And I realized that many of them were giving for USDA grants a lot of proprietary information and financial information to USDA. And then with the DOGE cuts, there was a lot of consternation that many of that financial information was then being disclosed to third parties. And they weren't liking that. And so that's when I put in safeguards and I wrote a letter and then submitted legislation to protect our farmers across this country, who I have to say I'm very sad about. 56% increase in bankruptcies this year over last, with all that's going on with tariffs and workforce and some of the USDA cuts. That's a side note. That's just my farmer side that's protecting them. I'm a mama bear with my farmers.
Right. Managing a district that's both the cutting edge of tech and tech policy and
I call it a purple district with no purple people. It's an incredible district. It goes from Montgomery County through Frederick, Allegheny, Garrett, and Washington counties, all the way to the West Virginia and Pennsylvania border. But it is a microcosm of America with the 270 corridor. And it's really an incredible opportunity for me to see all of the different issues across America are really in my district. And I see the impact of many of the different, whether they be on farmers or rural. A big part of my agenda is also how technology impacts rural America in terms of broadband. And when I was at NTIA, I was the number 2 at NTIA. I think Commissioner Gomez is here afterwards, and she held my same position as well. But we rolled out the $65 billion broadband plan with BEAD and did a lot of the spectrum allocation. And much of our rural communities still are without broadband and still are unable to access all that they need to really lift themselves up. So I have been very much focused on broadband and also how we drive investment into some of our rural communities, and particularly with respect to the cuts with Medicaid and other cuts about figuring out how we can help our rural hospitals with telehealth.
Okay. You mentioned rural broadband, and that's a topic where you're really a deep expert. You have probably more expertise than nearly anyone in Congress, I think. Before you came to Congress, you served in the Biden administration, working on the BEAD program to bring broadband to all Americans. BEAD saw some delays under the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration has revamped it. So, what do you think of BEAD? Do you think the Biden administration got it 100% right?
Well, no administration ever gets 100% right. I'd like to say we got it 100% right, but I'm very proud of what Secretary Raimondo, and I worked with Alan Davidson, who was the assistant secretary. I was the deputy assistant secretary. We worked really hard and actually lockstep with the FCC in terms of finding the unserved and underserved areas across this country. And think about it. The Internet for All program was about giving affordable, high-speed internet, and affordable is really key, to everyone. And so they say, well, you didn't do it in 3 years. Well, who puts out a $65 billion infrastructure investment across America and has to figure out where are all the unserved places? We actually were able to figure out the maps and make the grants, the state block grants, and then there were many shovels about to go into the ground. The problem is that there was a fiber preference, which I actually do believe is the right thing. Not always is a fiber preference, but that fiber is more scalable, more climate resistant, and in the long run is more affordable. Because if you think about it, some of these other technologies that are now being proposed, lower cost, but it's a little bit penny wise, pound foolish, because the resiliency and the scalability is not there in the same ways, and still a latency issue. It's still not quite at the same latency, but also more importantly, I think in the long term, it's going to be less affordable for rural America. Because when you start to look at some of the satellite applications, some of the other applications, I think will be in the long term much more expensive. And in addition to that, we had through the FCC some programs that really worked on affordability that have not been revamped. And I'm really sad about that because I think we did do a good job. We were about to get there. Zoning and permitting does need to be streamlined. I give it up to this administration. We do need to work on that. But we need to also think about to immediately allow it to all go to maybe our LEOs, or I think for most businesses, I think there are a lot of small and mid-size internet service providers who better know the areas in rural America who might be able to give more affordable and better service in the short term. So I am concerned. I did push back. I sent a letter to Secretary of Commerce and really kind of pushed back on making sure that BEAD was not completely dismantled. And then the last thing I'll say is there is some sort of knee-jerk trigger reaction to the word equity. I traveled this country on digital equity grants, and for some reason, it really should never have been called digital equity grants. They should have called digital education grants. What it was is for adoption, these equity grants were to be given to different communities that they could best make use of the internet. Whether I was in Oklahoma with Governor Stitt, and it was how would the tribal communities best make use of internet. I was in Maine with the governor, and how do these lobster farmers reinvent themselves and use connectivity to have some agritourism in their communities. English as a second language, senior centers. And so it was really about having that internet be tailored to specific communities, because we have a big, wide country that has lots of different pockets. And how do you make it accessible so that every community can thrive? So I am a little sad, but I think that there's a February 11th comment period, and I'm going to send in some comments. So
Great. I'll look out for those.
Yeah.
You'll have plenty to say.
Yeah.
So what other topics in data, privacy, and online safety do you find most pressing for you and your fellow members of Congress right now?
So I'm going to lift up. I started practicing in 1989 with Cohen and Marks. Stanley Cohen was my mentor. He was at the end of his career then, and I was 25. He must have been in his 60s, and he took me under his arm and under his wing and taught me about the Communications Act of 34. And he had been a Jew American Jews shot down during World War II and put into a concentration camp. And when he came out, he almost starved to death. He went to Harvard Law School and he said, I think it is so important to have freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and make sure that there is always a robust communications world. And he taught me about the Act of 34, serving the public interest. I said not more than 16 broadcast stations at that time, but how do you have a lot of players that have robust competition, fair and level playing field, protection for consumers, protections for children? How do we use community programming and still promoting U.S. innovation and our national security? And as I've been lifting up and thinking about my starting out as a broadcast attorney and now, I'm looking at this unprecedented vertical and horizontal integration and a light touch from our FCC, maybe a light touch in regulation, but a heavy touch from this administration. And I really think that our piecemeal legislation on privacy, on data, on algorithms, on cybersecurity, on AI, I think that we need, and maybe I'm going to call for it, I think we almost have to have a new deal on infrastructure, AI, data, and platform accountability that comes together, because what we have now does not meet the moment. It was created in 1934 and amended in 96. And you hear about sunsetting 230 and data and all of these things. But what we really need is, if you look at what happened just this week, and listen, I love business. I love innovation. My husband's a 3-company entrepreneur. I believe in pragmatism. But you have an entity who has satellite infrastructure. If you look at SpaceX, they've got the satellite infrastructure, terrestrial infrastructure, a platform with X and some of our social media, and then you have an AI company. So you have this wide range of infrastructure and the content. And the ability of what that means for other players in the marketplace, what that means for surveillance, for data, for even commerce, who we are as a country, I think we need to examine that. And I would love to call for a bipartisan, but also multi-stakeholder commission that looks at these issues and really lifts up and has a new deal on how we can go back to many of the things that we all kind of want: robust competition, fairness, trustworthiness in our media, looking at accountability. When there's bad actors, things happen. And I did mention I'm even looking at AI chatbots and how AI impacts our kids as well, not just social media. But when we think about all of these things coming together, I could talk about many different bills, but we're going to have congressional buy-in and business buy-in. And actually, it'll give more opportunities to business and help us innovate. Because do we want it consolidated into 2 or 3 different companies? I don't think so. I think we need to lift up. And I just know, I love this country. I ran on common sense, common ground, and I often say I'm desperately trying to find it. But I do believe that in the end, we will figure out a way to get through this period. But this convergence that we used to talk about in the 90s, there truly is a convergence right now. And it is the most important thing we can do for our economy, for our democracy, for the health and well-being of us as citizens, and for our children. And I ran because I have 4 daughters, 18 to 32, and a brand new grandbaby. So that is why. And I'm learning all the new toys for a 1-year-old. So that is what I think we need to look at, is reinventing as the state of the net. And it's all of you in the room who need to be part of it, because it's going to define, I'm a communication studies major by background, it's going to define who we are. And we have been the beacon of light for this world. And I do believe diversity is our strength and unity is our power. And we need to unify from diverse sections of this country and diverse stakeholders to come together to define who we are. So I guess you turn 60 and you become kind of a truth teller.
Powerful, powerful. We need more of those. Congratulations on the new grandbaby.
Baby Charlie. After 4 daughters, my husband finally got the little boy. We took him 32 years. Yeah, but those his daughters. I'm not saying that. So, yeah, I'm happy to take questions or what have you. And
Do you have a few minutes? Anyone? Question for the Congresswoman?
What is one of your important was working as a congresswoman?
one of the most important laws, right, that I have really focused on, in addition to some of these telecom laws I've talked about, is I really think it's important that we fully fund our research agencies like NIST, NIH, National Cancer Institute, USDA. They've been having unbelievable assaults, and not only on our government workers, but we're really undercutting a lot of the institutional and research expertise that we have as a country. And I've been pushing back forcefully because I do believe that our foundational research underpins many of our small businesses, our entrepreneurs, and I keep saying our U.S. competitiveness and national security. And in those cuts, which were so penny wise, pound foolish, we really undercut our security and our resilience. And we're seeing it again and again, from NOAA to NIH to all of these different places. But we were able to claw back a lot of it in the most recent appropriations. But that is a big thing for me, is to protect our research agencies and universities.
So talking about NIST, we've heard,
I love NIST.
so on Friday, I heard Representative Oprah talking about some sort of AI regulatory framework, one that would codify what used to be the AI Safety Institute and have that be like the center hub of like a hub and spoke model for some sort of AI regulatory framework. I was curious what you think of that. What do you think Casey might need to like really fulfill that mission?
That's a really interesting question. And I haven't gotten all the details from Albert Nolte about that. I do know that they had a bipartisan commission that he was part of, I think it was last year, that came out. Sadly, none of those task force proposals were taken up. I do think that NIST is the right place to do a lot of that framework because they have so many experts on quantum and on just all different aspects of AI. And I do think that there should be some framework for them. I hesitate to only have it at NIST because I think that there are other stakeholders that are also our universities and even private companies that are involved in that. And so I do think we should have some standards. I do think that there should be some coordination. And I do think that we should have some greater collaborations. And the National Science Foundation, and we just had Science Based Technology just had an amazing hearing on quantum and our investments in quantum, which also bisect with a lot of those discussions as well. But I'd love to talk to you offline about that because I have a lot of thoughts, and actually I'm putting out a bill in about a month on something that's related to that.
One more.
Not that it'll see the light of day, being in the minority, but we're working towards it.
Thank you so much. Maureen Backstrom, Inside AI Policy. Can you please walk us through your thinking on making your legislation targeted to kids? Because over the years, we've seen parts of the Democratic or Progressive Coalition align with the tech industry, albeit for different reasons, to oppose age verification and validation measures.
It's hard. It's hard. Perfect is the enemy of the good, and I'm not going to tell you it's not. I do think that that children need to be protected. And we've all seen skyrocketing depression, anxiety, mental health issues, self-mutilation, suicides, depression. I mean, it goes on and on. And many of the tech companies, listen, I was there 10 years ago when many of them had the information that it was so doing and weren't right about it. So I think it is important to put bumpers and safeguards and extra protections on for children. And that includes algorithmic design protections, privacy protections, and more study about it. Age verification has always been very difficult, and kids, including my own teenagers, have been very adept at going around it and figuring it out. So it is hard. But I think that I come from the viewpoint that I'm not quite so sure that some of those First Amendment issues that are being brought up are necessary, that they're always valid. I think that you can work through them. And I think the devil is always in the details. But I do think that we have completely walked away from our kids and their well-being. And I think it's despicable that we as a country are allowing some of the things to happen online, from deep fakes to AI generated porn. I mean, the dark web is a bad place to be. It's a wild west that has been wild for over 15, 20 years. And so I kind of look towards Europe. They have been much better, from the Digital Services Act to the Digital Marketing Act, if you look at their new AI Act. And I'm not saying that we take all of that into the US, but I also hear, and I remember when I was at NTIA, they'd say, oh, we can't do this or this. And I'm like, well, why can't you? You're doing it in Europe. And so I think it's maybe we take some of those core protections and figure out ways to integrate them here. And I don't think that means that you're going to undercut a business's bottom line. I firmly believe that businesses should make a profit and they should be able to invest, but it's not a one-way street. And that communications and the power of technology, the most important thing when a despot goes into and takes over a country, the first thing they do is control the communications outlets. And this is really important, that we take back control over how our kids, how all of us are impacted by technology and our collective health and well-being. And I think that as a country, we really need to lift up, because this democracy, it's 250 years old, and I want it to keep on being so. So that's a longer response to age verification, but I'm happy to give you a little extra offline as well as some ideas I have about it. I think we're out of time, though. I get the red blinking light. If you have any questions, I do respond. I believe in being very accessible. My email is rep.mcleandelaney@mail.house.gov, and my staff is always willing and able to answer questions. So, yeah.